Foster care is built on trust. Trust that a child will be protected. That adults chosen by the state will act in the child's best interest. That discipline will never cross the line into harm. In this case, that trust was placed in a man who described himself as traditional, firm, old-fashioned. He told social workers he believed in structure, in rules, in consequences, and when concerns were raised about the child in his care, he had an answer ready. The boy was difficult, he said, uncooperative, behind in development before he ever arrived. There were no bruises, no emergency room visits, no dramatic incident demanding attention, just a quiet child, growing quieter. To the system, it looked like a placement that required patience. To the foster father, it was proof that discipline was working. For years, the explanation went unchallenged, until the court requested a set of records no one thought mattered. Records that didn't describe behavior, or attitude, or obedience. They measured something far simpler: how much a child grew, and how long he had been kept from doing so. The prosecutor stood and placed a single chart on the courtroom screen. "This document," she said, "tracks the child's height over 5 years." There was no emotion in her voice, just numbers, dates, lines that barely moved. She paused. "During this entire period," she continued, "the child lived in the defendant's home." The foster father sat upright, hands folded, expression unchanged. Discipline, he had claimed. But as the judge leaned forward to study the chart, it became clear. This case was no longer about parenting styles. It was about what discipline could never explain. To understand how the truth stayed hidden for so long, you have to go back to the placement everyone believed was safe. The boy arrived in early spring. He was 6 years old. Small for his age, according to the intake paperwork, but not unusually so. His caseworker noted that he had been through 3 placements in 18 months. Each one had ended for administrative reasons. Budget constraints. A foster parent's medical leave. A family relocating out of state. Nothing in the file suggested the child himself was the problem. He was described as cooperative, quiet, a little withdrawn, which was expected given his history. His mother had struggled with addiction. His father was not in the picture. The state had removed him from the home when he was 4, after neighbors reported he'd been left alone for days at a time. Since then, he had lived in temporary housing, emergency shelters, and a series of foster placements that never quite became permanent. The system was looking for stability, a home where he could stay, where he could grow. The foster father had been licensed for 3 years by the time the boy was placed with him. He lived in a rural area in a modest 2-story house surrounded by farmland. The home study had been completed without issue. His background check was clean. His references spoke well of him. He was in his mid-50s, divorced, no children of his own. He told the social worker he had time now, space, a desire to give back. He said he understood that foster children came with challenges, that patience was required, that structure and consistency were what these kids needed most. The caseworker was encouraged. The boy was placed on a Friday afternoon. The foster father signed the necessary paperwork. He shook the caseworker's hand. He knelt down to the boy's level and told him he was welcome here. The boy didn't say much. He held a small backpack containing everything he owned. The caseworker reminded the foster father about the follow-up visit in 2 weeks. She gave him the contact numbers for the county office, the pediatrician, and the emergency line. Then she left. And for a while it seemed like the placement was working. The first follow-up visit went smoothly. The caseworker arrived on schedule. The house was clean. The boy had his own room. There was food in the refrigerator. The foster father reported no problems. The boy, when asked how he was doing, nodded. He didn't volunteer much, but he didn't seem distressed. The caseworker noted in her report that the child was adjusting, that the foster father appeared committed, that there were no immediate concerns. A month later, the same pattern. The boy was enrolled in school. He was attending regularly. His teacher reported that he was quiet but not disruptive. He completed his work. He didn't cause trouble. The foster father told the caseworker the boy was learning the rules, that he responded well to routine, that he was beginning to open up. The caseworker saw no reason to doubt him. The boy's file was updated. The placement was marked as stable. And then the visits became less frequent. This was normal. When a placement is going well, the system's attention shifts elsewhere. There are always new emergencies, new removals, new crises demanding immediate intervention. A quiet child in a stable home is exactly what the system hopes for. So the caseworker moved on to other cases. The foster father was left to manage the placement on his own. And that's when things began to change. The rules in the house were strict. The boy was expected to wake at a certain time, to dress himself, to make his bed without being reminded. Breakfast was at a set hour. If he was late, he didn't eat. The foster father believed in natural consequences. If the boy forgot his lunch, he went hungry. If he didn't complete his chores, he lost privileges. The foster father explained this to the caseworker during one of the quarterly visits. He said the boy needed to learn responsibility, that coddling him wouldn't help him in the long run. The caseworker didn't disagree. Structure was important for children who had experienced chaos. Consistency was key. The foster father's approach sounded reasonable. But what the caseworker didn't see was how those rules were applied, how the consequences escalated, how discipline became something else entirely. The boy learned quickly that mistakes were not tolerated, that asking for things was seen as entitlement, that showing emotion was a sign of weakness. He learned to be quiet, to stay out of the way, to make himself small. And he learned that no one was coming to check. At school, the boy was unremarkable. He sat in the back of the classroom. He didn't raise his hand often. He didn't make friends easily. His first-grade teacher noticed he was thin, but so were other kids. Rural poverty was common in the area. Plenty of children came to school hungry. The teacher made sure he got breakfast in the cafeteria. She kept granola bars in her desk and would slip him one if he looked particularly tired. She thought she was helping. She didn't realize she was the only person feeding him some days. The boy never complained. He never told her he was hungry. He had learned that complaining made things worse. When the teacher asked if everything was okay at home, he nodded. When she asked if his foster father was nice to him, he nodded again. He had been taught what to say. The foster father had made it clear. If the boy caused problems at school, if he told lies, if he made the foster father look bad, there would be consequences. The boy believed him. So he stayed quiet. And the teacher, seeing no obvious signs of distress, moved on. The foster father's discipline had a logic to it. At least that's what he told himself. The boy needed to learn. Needed to understand that actions had consequences. Needed to be prepared for a world that wouldn't coddle him. But underneath that logic was something else. Something the foster father didn't name even to himself. The boy was different. Not just in behavior or background, but in a way that bothered the foster father more than he wanted to admit. The boy was black. The foster father was white. And in the foster father's mind, that difference mattered. He didn't consider himself racist. He would have denied it if asked. But his treatment of the boy was shaped by assumptions he didn't examine. Assumptions about discipline. About respect. About what this particular child needed to learn. He was harder on the boy than he would have been on a white child. He expected more. Tolerated less. Saw defiance where there was only confusion. Saw laziness where there was only exhaustion. The boy's race became an unspoken justification for increasingly harsh treatment. A reason the foster father could point to privately when he wondered if he was being too strict. These kids need a firm hand, he told himself. They're used to chaos. They don't respond to softness. He convinced himself he was doing the boy a favor, teaching him what he needed to know. And when the boy withdrew further, became quieter, more compliant, the foster father saw it as proof that his methods were working. He didn't see the fear, or the hunger, or the way the boy had learned to make himself invisible just to survive. By the end of the first year, the pattern was set. The boy woke early. He dressed quickly. He ate whatever he was given, which was often very little. He went to school. He kept his head down. He came home. At home, he did his chores. He stayed in his room. He didn't ask for anything. The foster father reported to the caseworker that the placement was going well, that the boy had adjusted, that there were no problems. And because the boy didn't contradict him, because there were no visible injuries, because the school hadn't raised alarms, the caseworker believed him. The file was updated again. Placement stable. No concerns. The system moved on. And the boy remained trapped in a house where the rules kept tightening, where discipline became deprivation, where survival meant silence. The caseworker's visits became even less frequent in the second year. This was standard protocol for stable placements. Resources were limited. Time was stretched thin. The cases that demanded attention were the ones in crisis. And this case on paper was not in crisis. The foster father was compliant with all requirements. He attended the mandatory training sessions. He submitted his quarterly reports on time. He brought the boy to medical appointments when required. Everything looked fine. But the visits the caseworker made were scheduled. The foster father knew when she was coming. He prepared. The house was cleaned. The boy was dressed in clothes that fit at least for that day. There was food visible in the kitchen. The foster father was calm, cooperative. He answered questions easily. And the boy, when asked, said what he had been taught to say. Yes, everything is fine. No, I don't need anything. The caseworker had no reason to dig deeper. She had 30 other cases. 3 of them were in active crisis. She needed to triage. And this case, by all appearances, was not an emergency. So she checked the boxes, filed the report, and moved on. The boy's second-grade teacher noticed he seemed tired. He fell asleep during silent reading time more than once. She gently woke him and suggested he go to bed earlier. He nodded but didn't explain that he often lay awake at night, hungry, listening to the foster father move around downstairs. The teacher also noticed his clothes were getting loose. She mentioned it to the school nurse during a routine conversation. The nurse made a note to check his weight at the next health screening. But the screening was months away. And by then, other students had taken priority. The boy slipped through. Not because anyone was negligent, but because he didn't cause problems. Because he was quiet. Because there were louder, more obvious needs demanding attention. He had learned to be invisible. And it was working. At home, the deprivation was not dramatic. It was incremental. The foster father didn't withhold food entirely. He just controlled it. The boy ate breakfast, but only what was given. If he asked for more, he was told he was being greedy. Lunch was packed by the foster father. It was often minimal. A sandwich. No snacks. No fruit. Dinner was served, but portions were small. The boy learned not to ask for seconds. The foster father told himself this was teaching the boy discipline. Teaching him not to be wasteful. Teaching him gratitude. But the reality was simpler. The boy was being systematically underfed. Not enough to trigger immediate concern. Not enough to cause a collapse or a hospital visit. Just enough to keep him small. To keep him weak. To keep him compliant. And because the deprivation was gradual, because the boy's body adapted slowly, it didn't register as abuse. It registered as a child who was naturally small. Who had always been behind in growth. Who, as the foster father would later claim, simply had a poor appetite. The boy's growth, or lack of it, was not tracked carefully during those years. He saw a pediatrician for the required annual checkups. The doctor noted his height and weight. But there was no comparison year over year. No chart flagging that his growth had stalled. The records were filed. The visits were brief. The doctor saw a quiet child who didn't complain of pain or illness. She saw a foster father who seemed attentive, who answered her questions appropriately. She had no reason to suspect neglect. And so the boy's stunted growth went unnoticed. Year after year. His body adapted to chronic hunger by slowing down. By conserving energy. By stopping the growth that required resources he wasn't being given. And the foster father watched this happen and told himself it was normal. That some kids were just small. That the boy's biological parents had probably been small too. He didn't acknowledge what he was doing. Didn't connect his rules, his portion control, his punishment of asking for food, with the fact that the boy wasn't growing. Or maybe he did acknowledge it. And simply didn't care. By the 3rd year, the boy had learned the system completely. He knew what to say during caseworker visits. He knew how to behave at school so no one asked questions. He knew how to move through the house without drawing the foster father's attention. He had become expert at survival. But survival was costing him. His body was paying the price. His height remained nearly unchanged from the year before. His weight hovered at a level far below what it should have been. His energy was low. His concentration suffered. His immune system weakened. He caught every cold that went through the school. He missed days at a time. The foster father told the school the boy was prone to illness. That he had a weak constitution. The school accepted this explanation. And the boy returned to class, thinner and quieter than before. The caseworker assigned to the boy's case changed in the 3rd year. This was common. Turnover in child services was high. The new caseworker inherited a file that showed a stable placement. No red flags. No history of complaints. She scheduled a visit and met with the foster father and the boy. Everything seemed fine. The foster father was polite. The house was in order. The boy was subdued, but that fit with his history of trauma. The caseworker noted that the boy seemed small for his age. She asked the foster father if there were any health concerns. The foster father shook his head. The boy's just small, he said. Always has been. The caseworker accepted this. She had no reason not to. And the visit ended with the same conclusion as all the others. Placement stable. No action needed. It wasn't until the 4th year that anyone began to ask deeper questions. And even then it wasn't because of the boy. It was because of a policy change. The state had implemented new guidelines for monitoring foster placements. Part of those guidelines included more thorough medical reviews. Caseworkers were instructed to request complete medical records for children in long-term placements. Not just the most recent checkup, but the full history. The new caseworker, following protocol, requested the boy's records from his pediatrician. She didn't expect to find anything unusual. This was just paperwork, a box to check. But when the records arrived, something caught her attention. The boy's height measurements over 4 years. She spread them out on her desk. Year 1, 3 feet, 9 inches. Year 2, 3 feet, 10 inches. Year 3, 3 feet, 10 inches. Year 4, 3 feet, 11 inches. She stared at the numbers. A healthy child should grow roughly 2 to 3 inches per year. This child had grown 2 inches in 4 years. She pulled up growth charts online. She compared the boy's measurements to the standards for his age. He was in the bottom 5th percentile. And his growth velocity, the rate at which he should have been growing, had essentially flatlined. She picked up the phone and called her supervisor. The supervisor reviewed the records. She agreed the numbers were concerning. But concerning didn't mean conclusive. Some children were naturally small. Some had genetic or hormonal issues that affected growth. The supervisor instructed the caseworker to request additional records. School health screenings. Any previous medical history from before the boy entered foster care. Anything that might explain the growth pattern. The caseworker sent the request. And while she waited for responses, she scheduled an unannounced visit to the foster home. The unannounced visit happened on a Tuesday afternoon. The caseworker knocked on the door. The foster father answered, clearly surprised. She explained she was in the area and thought she'd check in. He led her inside. The house was quieter than usual. Less prepared. The boy was in his room doing homework. The caseworker asked to speak with him alone. The foster father hesitated, then agreed. She sat with the boy at the kitchen table. She asked him how he was doing. He said fine. She asked if he was eating enough. He nodded. She asked if the foster father ever punished him by withholding food. He shook his head. His answers were automatic. Rehearsed. She could see it. But she didn't know how to get past it. The boy had been trained too well. She thanked him and spoke briefly with the foster father before leaving. She noted in her report that the boy seemed unusually compliant, that his responses felt scripted. But without evidence, without the boy disclosing abuse, there was nothing she could do. Not yet. The school records arrived a week later. They included health screenings from the past 3 years. The nurse had measured the boy's height each year. The numbers matched what the pediatrician had recorded. Minimal growth. Year after year. But there was something else in the records. Notes from the school nurse. Brief observations. Year 2, student appears thin. Recommended additional breakfast program. Year 3, student frequently requests crackers. Seems hungry. Year 4, clothing loose. Weight below average. None of the notes had triggered an investigation. They were filed. Forgotten. But now, read together, they painted a picture. The caseworker compiled everything into a report. The growth records. The school notes. Her observations from the unannounced visit. She sent it to her supervisor with a recommendation. The placement should be investigated further. The supervisor agreed. But investigations take time. There were protocols. Procedures. The foster father had rights. The boy would need to be interviewed by someone trained in forensic questioning. Medical experts would need to review the records and provide opinions. The process could take weeks, maybe months. The supervisor told the caseworker to continue monitoring the placement, to increase the frequency of visits, to document everything. And so the caseworker waited, and visited, and documented. And the boy remained in the home, unaware that anyone had noticed. Unaware that the numbers he didn't even know existed were finally telling the story he had been too afraid to speak. The foster father sensed something had changed. The caseworker's visits were more frequent now. Her questions were sharper. She asked about meals, about the boy's appetite, about whether he ever complained of being hungry. The foster father answered calmly. The boy eats fine, he said. He's just small. He's always been small. If there was a problem, I would have noticed. He was confident. He believed his own narrative. He had been saying it for so long that it felt true. And he couldn't imagine that anyone would question him. After all, he was doing everything the system asked. He attended the trainings. He filed the reports. He brought the boy to appointments. He was a model foster parent. Why would anyone doubt him? But doubt had already taken root. And the investigation, quiet and procedural, was moving forward. The forensic interview was scheduled for a Thursday morning. The boy was pulled from school by a caseworker he didn't recognize. She told him they were going to talk to someone, that he wasn't in trouble, that he just needed to answer some questions. He sat in the back seat of her car, silent, watching the unfamiliar streets pass by. They arrived at a building he'd never seen before. Inside, the walls were painted in soft colors. There were toys in the waiting room. It was designed to feel safe. But the boy knew better than to trust safe-looking places. A woman greeted him. She introduced herself and explained that they were going to talk for a little while. Just the two of them. She led him into a small room with a table and chairs. There was a camera mounted in the corner, though she didn't draw attention to it. She asked if he wanted water. He shook his head. She smiled and told him there were no wrong answers, that he could take his time, that she just wanted to understand how things were at home. The boy said nothing. She asked simple questions first. What grade was he in? What his favorite subject was? Whether he had friends at school. He answered in single words. Short sentences. She moved slowly toward harder questions. Did he like living with his foster father? He nodded. Did his foster father ever yell at him? Sometimes he said. Did his foster father ever hit him? No. Did he ever go to bed hungry? The boy hesitated. The woman waited. Sometimes he said quietly. She asked him to explain. He struggled to find words. He said that if he didn't finish his chores, he didn't get dinner. That if he was late for breakfast, he missed it. That the foster father said he needed to learn. The woman asked if this happened a lot. The boy shrugged. She asked what he usually ate for lunch. He described the small sandwiches, the lack of snacks. She asked if he ever told anyone he was hungry. He shook his head. Why not, she asked. He looked down at his hands. Because it would make it worse, he said. The forensic interviewer's report was added to the growing file. The boy's statements were carefully documented. He had disclosed food deprivation, not dramatic starvation, but consistent, deliberate withholding of adequate nutrition. Paired with the medical records showing stunted growth, it was enough. The supervisor convened a meeting with the county's child protection team. They reviewed the evidence, the growth charts, the school nurse's notes, the forensic interview, the caseworker's observations. There was agreement that the placement was no longer appropriate, but there was disagreement about what came next. Some members of the team felt the evidence pointed to neglect. Others felt it was inconclusive. The foster father could argue the boy was a picky eater, that he refused food, that the stunted growth was a pre-existing condition. Without more concrete proof, a criminal case would be difficult to win. But the child's safety came first. The decision was made to remove the boy from the home while the investigation continued. The removal happened on a Friday. 2 caseworkers arrived at the school just before dismissal. They spoke with the principal, explained the situation, and asked to take the boy into protective custody. The principal agreed. The boy was called to the office. He saw the caseworkers and his stomach dropped. He thought he had done something wrong. They reassured him, told him he wasn't in trouble, told him he was going to stay somewhere else for a little while. He asked if he could get his things from the foster father's house. They told him they would take care of it. He didn't argue. He had learned not to argue. He left with them, walking out of the school with his backpack and nothing else. He was placed in an emergency shelter that night. A temporary bed in a room with 3 other boys. He didn't sleep much. He didn't know what was happening. Didn't know if he'd be going back. Didn't know if he'd be in trouble for whatever he'd said in that interview room. All he knew was that the rules had changed again, and he didn't know how to follow them. The foster father was informed of the removal by phone. A supervisor from the county called and explained that the boy had been taken into protective custody pending an investigation. The foster father was calm at first. He asked what the investigation was about. The supervisor explained there were concerns about the boy's health and nutrition. The foster father's tone shifted. He said the boy was fine, that he had been fine the entire time, that this was ridiculous. The supervisor remained professional. She explained that the investigation was standard procedure, that the foster father would have an opportunity to respond to the concerns, that his cooperation was expected. The foster father hung up. He sat in his quiet house and replayed the conversation. He was angry, insulted. He had done everything right. He had provided structure, discipline, exactly what the boy needed. And now he was being accused of what? Neglect? It was absurd. He picked up the phone and called his sister. She listened as he vented. She told him he should get a lawyer. He dismissed the idea at first. He didn't need a lawyer. He hadn't done anything wrong. But she insisted. And eventually he agreed. The lawyer he hired was a defense attorney with experience in family court. She listened to his version of events. He told her the boy had always been small, that he had behavioral issues, that he required firm discipline, that he was never abused or neglected. The lawyer asked about the food. The foster father explained his rules. The boy had to follow the schedule. If he didn't, there were consequences. That's not neglect, the foster father said. That's parenting. The lawyer made notes. She told him the state would likely argue that withholding food was abuse, that the growth records would be difficult to explain. The foster father insisted there was an explanation. The boy was just small. Genetics, maybe a hormone problem. The lawyer told him they would need a medical expert to support that theory. She said she would start building his defense. But she also warned him. If this goes to trial, she said, you need to be prepared. The state will paint you in the worst possible light. They'll say you targeted this child. They'll say it was racially motivated. The foster father bristled. I'm not racist, he said. The lawyer nodded. I believe you, she said. But the prosecution won't care what you believe. They'll care what they can prove. The investigation continued over the next several weeks. Detectives interviewed the boy's teachers. They reviewed every caseworker report from the past 4 years. They obtained additional medical records, including growth charts from before the boy entered the foster home. Those early records showed he had been growing normally. Not exceptionally tall, but within the normal range. His growth had slowed dramatically only after he was placed with the foster father. The detectives also interviewed neighbors. Most had little to say. The foster father kept to himself. The boy was rarely seen outside. One neighbor mentioned that she thought it was strange how thin the boy looked. But she hadn't reported it. She assumed someone else was paying attention. Another neighbor recalled seeing the foster father and the boy at the grocery store once. The boy had asked for a snack. The foster father had told him no sharply. The neighbor remembered because the boy had looked so dejected. But again, she hadn't thought much of it at the time. These small observations, none significant on their own, began to accumulate. The detectives compiled their findings into a report. They forwarded it to the county prosecutor. The prosecutor assigned to the case was a woman named Janet Coyle. She had been with the county for 12 years. She had prosecuted child abuse cases before, but this one was different. There were no broken bones, no bruises, no emergency room visits. The abuse was hidden in numbers, in measurements, in a child's body that had quietly stopped growing. She read through the file carefully. The growth charts were stark. The boy's measurements barely changed over 4 years. The school nurse's notes corroborated the medical records. The forensic interview showed a child who had been conditioned to accept deprivation as normal. And the foster father's own statements, documented in caseworker reports, revealed a philosophy of discipline that crossed into cruelty. Coyle believed there was enough to charge him. But she knew it would be a difficult case to win. Defense attorneys would argue the evidence was circumstantial. That poor growth could have many causes. That the boy's statements were unreliable. She needed more. She needed an expert who could explain to a jury why the growth charts mattered. Why they told a story that couldn't be dismissed. She reached out to a pediatric endocrinologist. Dr. Raymond Keller had testified in court before. He was a professor at the State University and had published extensively on childhood growth disorders. Coyle sent him the boy's medical records and asked for his opinion. Dr. Keller reviewed them over the course of a week. When he called Coyle back, his tone was grave. This child's growth pattern is consistent with chronic malnutrition, he said. Not starvation in the dramatic sense, but sustained inadequate caloric intake over years. Coyle asked if there could be another explanation. Dr. Keller said there could be. Hormonal disorders, genetic conditions, chronic illness. But the boy had been tested for common growth disorders during his initial pediatric visits. The tests were normal. And more importantly, Dr. Keller said, the boy had been growing normally before the placement. That's the key, he explained. If this were a genetic or hormonal issue, we'd expect to see stunted growth from birth. But this child was growing at a normal rate until age 6. Then his growth essentially stopped. The timing aligns exactly with his placement in the foster home. Coyle asked if he would testify. Dr. Keller agreed. With the medical expert secured, Coyle moved forward. She filed charges against Thomas Richard Halvorson. Felony child neglect. Aggravated abuse of a dependent. And, controversially, a hate-based motive enhancement. The last charge was the most difficult to prove. Coyle would have to show that Halvorson's treatment of the boy was motivated, at least in part, by racial animus. She had no explicit evidence. No slurs documented in reports. No overtly racist statements. But she had a pattern. Halvorson had fostered one other child before the boy. A white girl. She had been placed with him for 6 months before being moved to relatives. Coyle obtained the case file for that placement. The reports painted a different picture. The foster father had been described as patient and attentive. The girl had been well fed, according to the caseworker's notes. She had even gained weight during her time in his care. There were no complaints. No disciplinary issues. The placement ended only because a relative was able to take her. Coyle compared the two cases side by side. The contrast was striking. 2 children. One white, one black. Treated completely differently by the same foster parent. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was suggestive. And Coyle intended to put it before a jury. Halvorson was arrested on a Tuesday morning. Detectives arrived at his home with a warrant. He answered the door in sweatpants and a t-shirt, coffee in hand. They read him his rights. He listened, expressionless. When they were finished, he asked if this was really necessary. They told him it was. He was taken to the county jail and booked. His lawyer arranged bail within hours. He was released that evening. The arrest made the local news. The story was brief. A local man had been charged with child neglect. No names were released due to the involvement of a minor. But in a small community, word spread quickly. People who knew Halvorson were shocked. He had always seemed responsible. Quiet. Not the kind of person you'd expect to be arrested. Some people defended him immediately. He's a good man, they said. He was trying to help that boy. Others were less certain. They remembered the boy. How thin he was. How quiet. They wondered if they should have said something sooner. Halvorson's preliminary hearing was set for 3 weeks later. His lawyer filed a motion to dismiss the charges, arguing the evidence was insufficient. The motion was denied. The case would proceed. In the meantime, Coyle continued building her case. She interviewed every teacher the boy had. She obtained records from the boy's previous placements, before he was placed with Halvorson. She found photographs. School pictures from each year. The visual progression was disturbing. In the first photo, taken shortly before the placement, the boy looked healthy. His face was full. His eyes were bright. In the photos from subsequent years, the change was visible. His face grew thinner. His eyes duller. By the 4th year, he looked gaunt. Coyle had the photos enlarged and mounted on boards. She planned to show them to the jury. Sometimes, she knew, people needed to see the evidence to believe it. The boy, meanwhile, was adjusting to yet another placement. He had been moved from the emergency shelter to a therapeutic foster home. The foster parents there were trained to work with children who had experienced trauma. They were patient. They didn't enforce rigid rules. They let the boy eat when he was hungry. At first, he didn't know what to do with that freedom. He hoarded food in his room. He ate quickly as if someone might take his plate away. The foster parents didn't scold him. They gently encouraged him to slow down, to trust that there would be more food later. It took weeks before he began to relax, to believe that he wasn't going to be punished for being hungry. A therapist visited him twice a week. She didn't push him to talk about what had happened. She let him play. Drop. Gradually he began to open up. He told her about the rules in Halvorson's house. About the times he went to bed hungry. About the fear he felt when he made mistakes. The therapist documented everything. Her notes would later be used as evidence. As the trial date approached, Coyle met with the boy to prepare him for testifying. She explained what court would be like. That he would sit in a chair and answer questions. That Halvorson would be in the room. The boy's eyes widened at that. He asked if he had to. Coyle knelt down to his level. "I know it's scary," she said. "But you're the only one who can tell the jury what it was like. No one else was there. No one else knows." The boy looked down. "What if I say the wrong thing?" he asked. Coyle shook her head. "There's no wrong thing," she said. "Just tell the truth. That's all anyone is asking." The boy nodded, but he didn't look convinced. The trial began on a Monday in late fall. The courtroom was small, with wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lights that hummed faintly. Halvorson sat at the defense table in a suit and tie. His lawyer sat beside him, reviewing notes. He looked calm, almost bored, as if this were an inconvenience, not a reckoning. The jury was selected over the course of the morning. 12 people, mostly middle-aged, a mix of men and women. Coyle studied them as they were sworn in. She needed them to see past the surface, to understand that abuse didn't always leave visible scars. The judge, an older man with a reputation for fairness, called the court to order. Coyle stood to deliver her opening statement. She walked to the center of the courtroom and faced the jury. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She spoke plainly. This case, she said, is about a child who was placed in the care of the defendant. A child who should have been protected. Who should have grown. Who should have thrived. Instead, she said, that child's growth stopped. Not because of a medical condition. Not because of genetics. But because the defendant systematically deprived him of adequate nutrition. She paused. Over the next several days, she continued, you will hear from doctors. From teachers. From caseworkers. And from the child himself. You will see medical records that show a boy who stopped growing the moment he entered the defendant's home. You will see photographs that show the physical toll of that deprivation. And you will hear the defendant's own explanations. Explanations that blame the child. That claim he was difficult. That claim he wouldn't eat. But the evidence will show you something different. It will show you a man who used discipline as a cover for cruelty. Who punished a child for being hungry. Who watched that child's body deteriorate and did nothing. She turned slightly, glancing at Halvorsen. The defendant will tell you he did nothing wrong. That he was simply teaching the child responsibility. But responsibility, she said, turning back to the jury, doesn't leave a child stunted and starving. That's not discipline. That's abuse. She returned to her seat. The defense attorney stood next. Her name was Linda Pritchard, and she had a reputation for being aggressive but fair. She approached the jury with a different tone. Sympathetic. Reasonable. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, foster care is not easy. The children who enter the system come with trauma. With challenges. With behaviors that require patience and structure. Mr. Halvorsen, she said, gesturing toward her client, opened his home to a child who needed help. He provided that child with shelter, with food, with stability. Was he perfect? No. No parent is. But the prosecution wants you to believe that because this child is small, Mr. Halvorsen must be guilty of abuse. That's not evidence. That's speculation. She walked slowly along the jury box. You will hear from medical experts, she said. But those experts will tell you that children grow at different rates. That some children are naturally smaller than others. That there are dozens of factors that affect growth, many of which have nothing to do with nutrition. The prosecution will show you charts and numbers. But numbers don't tell the whole story. They don't show you the hours Mr. Halvorsen spent trying to help this child adjust. The meals he prepared. The rules he enforced to give this child the structure he desperately needed. She paused. This case, she said, is about a man who tried to do the right thing. Who tried to help a child no one else wanted. And now, because that child didn't thrive the way everyone hoped, Mr. Halvorsen is being blamed. That's not justice. That's a rush to judgment. She returned to her seat and the judge called for a recess. The first witness was the caseworker who had finally noticed the growth records. Coyle walked her through the timeline. When she had requested the medical records. What she had seen. Why it concerned her. The caseworker was nervous on the stand. She spoke softly, and the judge had to remind her twice to speak up. But her testimony was clear. She had seen the pattern. The lack of growth. The notes from the school nurse. And when she compared it to the records from the boy's previous placements, the difference was stark. Pritchard cross-examined her gently. Did you ever witness Mr. Halvorsen withhold food from the child? No, the caseworker admitted. Did the child ever tell you he was being starved? Not in those words, no. So your concerns were based entirely on paperwork? The caseworker hesitated. They were based on evidence, she said. But Pritchard had made her point. No one had seen the abuse happen. It was all inference. The next witness was the school nurse. She brought her records with her, neatly organized in a binder. Coyle asked her to describe what she had observed over the years. The nurse explained that she had noted the boy's thin appearance multiple times. That she had made sure he received breakfast at school. That she had documented her concerns in the health files. Why didn't you report those concerns to child services? Coyle asked. The nurse looked uncomfortable. I didn't think it was severe enough, she said. A lot of kids in this district come from low-income families. Being thin isn't unusual. But looking back, she added, I wish I had said something sooner. Pritchard's cross-examination was brief. You never saw Mr. Halvorsen deny the child food, correct? Correct. And you never spoke to Mr. Halvorsen about your concerns? No. So you don't actually know what the child was eating at home? No, I don't. Pritchard nodded and sat down. The trial moved slowly, methodically. Each witness added another piece to the puzzle. Teachers described the boy as quiet, withdrawn, often tired. The pediatrician testified about the medical records. though she admitted she hadn't flagged the growth pattern at the time. A neighbor testified that she had seen the boy outside only a handful of times in 4 years, that he always seemed subdued. Each testimony built the case, but it was all circumstantial. Coyle knew the real impact would come from 2 witnesses, Dr. Keller, the pediatric endocrinologist, and the boy himself. Dr. Keller took the stand on the 4th day of the trial. He was in his 60s, with graying hair and a calm, professorial demeanor. Coyle qualified him as an expert, walking the jury through his credentials. Then she asked him to explain the boy's growth records. Dr. Keller used a large chart that had been mounted on an easel. He pointed to the measurements. A healthy child of this age, he said, should grow approximately 2 to 3 inches per year. This child grew less than half an inch per year over a 4-year period. That is not normal. Coyle asked what could cause such stunted growth. Dr. Keller listed the possibilities: hormonal disorders, chronic illness, genetic conditions, and malnutrition. He explained that the boy had been tested for the most common growth disorders. The test came back normal. There was no evidence of chronic illness. And the genetic explanation didn't fit, because the boy had been growing normally before the placement. That leaves malnutrition, Dr. Keller said. Chronic, sustained inadequate caloric intake. Coyle asked how certain he was. Dr. Keller looked directly at the jury. Based on the medical evidence, he said, I am confident that this child's growth was stunted due to insufficient nutrition during the years he lived with the defendant. Pritchard's cross-examination was more aggressive. She challenged Dr. Keller on every point. Couldn't there be other explanations you haven't considered? Dr. Keller acknowledged that medicine was not an exact science. But he stood by his conclusions. She asked if he had ever examined the boy in person. No, he admitted. His opinion was based on records alone. So you're speculating, Pritchard said. Dr. Keller shook his head. I'm drawing conclusions based on medical evidence, he said. That's what experts do. The exchange continued for another hour. But Dr. Keller didn't waver. And when Coyle redirected, she asked one final question. Dr. Keller, in your 30 years of practice, have you ever seen a growth pattern like this that wasn't caused by malnutrition or serious illness? Dr. Keller paused. No, he said. I haven't. The boy was scheduled to testify the next day. That night, Coyle met with him one last time. She reminded him to take his time, to answer only what was asked, to tell the truth. He nodded, but his hands were shaking. Coyle wanted to tell him it would be okay. But she didn't know if that was true. She didn't know how he would hold up under cross-examination. She didn't know if the jury would believe him. All she knew was that he deserved the chance to speak, to be heard. Even if it was terrifying. Even if it changed nothing. He deserved that much. The courtroom was quieter than usual when Marcus Allen Brooks entered. He was 10 years old now. Still small for his age, though he had gained some weight in the months since his removal. He wore khaki pants and a blue button-down shirt that was slightly too big. His current foster mother had insisted he looked nice, professional. But all Marcus felt was fear. He walked slowly to the witness stand, his eyes fixed on the floor. The bailiff asked him to raise his right hand. He did. His hand trembled. The judge spoke to him gently. Do you promise to tell the truth? Marcus nodded. Out loud, please, the judge said. Yes, Marcus whispered. The microphone barely picked it up. The judge asked if he needed the microphone adjusted. Marcus shook his head. Coyle stood and approached. She gave him a small smile, trying to put him at ease. It didn't help much. Coyle started with simple questions. Can you tell the jury your name? Marcus Allen Brooks. How old are you? 10. Where do you go to school? He named the elementary school. She asked about his current foster home. Whether he liked it there. Whether the people were nice to him. He nodded. They're nice, he said quietly. Coyle paused, giving him time to settle into the rhythm. Then she moved forward. Marcus, do you remember living with Mr. Halvorson? The boy's eyes flicked toward the defense table. Halvorson was watching him. Not angry. Not threatening. Just watching. Marcus looked away quickly. Yes, he said. How long did you live there? For years, he said. Coyle asked him to describe the house. He did, haltingly. It was big, he said. Quiet. I had my own room. Did you like living there? Marcus hesitated. It was okay, he said. The answer was automatic. Practiced. Coyle could hear it. She pressed gently. Marcus, I know this is hard. But I need you to tell the jury what it was really like. Not what you think you're supposed to say. What it was really like. The boy looked down at his hands. It was scary sometimes, he said. Coyle took her time. She asked Marcus to describe a typical day. He told her he had to wake up early, get dressed, make his bed. If he was late for breakfast, he didn't eat. What happened if you were late? Coyle asked. Mr. Halvorson said I had to learn responsibility, Marcus said. That if I couldn't follow the rules, I didn't deserve to eat. Did that happen a lot? Marcus nodded. A few times, he said. Coyle knew from the therapist's notes that it had happened more than a few times. But she didn't push. Not yet. She asked about school. Marcus said he brought his lunch. Mr. Halvorson packed it. What was in the lunch? Just a sandwich, Marcus said. Sometimes an apple. Was that enough? Marcus looked uncertain. I don't know, he said. Were you hungry during the day? He nodded. Sometimes. Did you tell anyone? He shook his head. Why not? Because Mr. Halvorson said I wasn't supposed to complain, Marcus said. He said if I told people things, I'd be lying. And liars got punished. The courtroom was silent. Every juror was watching Marcus now. Coyle let the moment sit before continuing. She asked about dinner. Marcus said they ate together. But the portions were small. If he asked for more, Mr. Halvorson said no. Did he ever explain why? Marcus nodded. He said I needed to learn not to be greedy. That I should be grateful for what I had. Were there times you went to bed hungry? Marcus hesitated. Yes, he said softly. A lot of times. Coyle asked him to describe how it felt. Marcus struggled to find words. My stomach hurt, he said. I couldn't sleep sometimes. I just wanted something to eat. Did you ever ask Mr. Halvorson for food at night? Once, Marcus said. What happened? He got mad, Marcus said. He told me I was being disrespectful. That I'd already had my dinner. He sent me back to bed. Did you ever ask again? Marcus shook his head. No. Coyle moved to a different topic. She asked Marcus if Mr. Halvorson ever punished him. Marcus nodded. What kind of punishments? I had to stand in the corner, Marcus said. Or I couldn't watch TV. Or I had to do extra chores. Did he ever hit you? No, Marcus said. But he yelled sometimes. What would he yell about? If I didn't do something right, Marcus said. Or if I asked for something. He didn't like it when I asked for things. Coyle asked for an example. Marcus thought for a moment. One time I asked if I could have a snack after school, he said. Mr. Halvorson got really mad. He said I was spoiled. That I didn't know how good I had it. He made me go to my room for the rest of the day. No dinner that night? Coyle asked. Marcus shook his head. No. Coyle knew she needed to address the racial element. But she had to do it carefully. She didn't want to put words in Marcus's mouth. Marcus, she said gently, did Mr. Halvorson ever say anything about the color of your skin? Marcus looked confused. I don't know, he said. Did he ever talk about you being black? Or about black people in general? Marcus thought hard. He said I needed to work harder than other kids, Marcus said finally. That people wouldn't give me chances. That I had to prove myself. Did he say why? Marcus shrugged. He just said that's how it was. Did he say the same things to other kids? I don't know, Marcus said. I was the only kid there. Coyle made a mental note. She would have to establish the racial element another way. She moved on. She asked Marcus about doctor's visits. He said Mr. Halvorson took him to the doctor once a year. The doctor weighed him and measured him. Asked if he felt okay. Marcus always said yes. What? Coyle asked. Why did you say yes even if you didn't feel okay? Because Mr. Halvorson was right there, Marcus said. And he told me before we went that I shouldn't cause problems. That if I said the wrong thing, people might take me away. And that would be my fault. Did you want to be taken away? Marcus looked down. I didn't know, he said. I just didn't want to make things worse. Coyle asked a few more questions. Then she turned to the jury. She wanted them to see Marcus. Really see him. Marcus, she said, when you lived with Mr. Halvorson, were you happy? The boy's eyes filled with tears. He shook his head. No, he whispered. Were you scared? He nodded. Yes. Do you feel safe now? He nodded again. Yes. Coyle let that answer hang in the air. Then she turned to the judge. No further questions. Pritchard stood. She approached Marcus slowly, her expression neutral. Marcus, she said, I just have a few questions for you. Okay. He nodded. You said Mr. Halvorson never hit you, is that right? Yes, Marcus said. And he never locked you in your room? No. He never denied you water or medical care? No. So the main issue is that you didn't get as much food as you wanted? Marcus looked uncertain. I guess, he said. Pritchard softened her tone. Marcus, I know this has been hard for you. But I need to ask, were there times when you refused to eat? When Mr. Halvorson offered you food and you said no? Marcus thought about it. Maybe, he said. Sometimes I wasn't hungry right away. So there were times when food was available and you chose not to eat it? I don't remember, Marcus said. But it's possible? Pritchard pressed. I guess, Marcus said. He looked like he wanted to disappear. Pritchard asked about his previous placements. Had he been happy there? Some of them, Marcus said. Had he always gotten enough to eat in those places? He nodded. I think so. So you know what it's like to be in a home where you're well fed? Yes, Marcus said. And you're saying that Mr. Halvorson's home was different? Yes, Marcus said, his voice barely audible. But you never told anyone, Pritchard said. Not your teachers. Not your caseworker. Not your doctor. Why should the jury believe you now? Coyle stood immediately. Objection, she said. Argumentative. Sustained, the judge said. Miss Pritchard, rephrase. Pritchard nodded. Marcus, she said, why didn't you tell anyone at the time that you were hungry? Because I was scared, Marcus said, louder now. Scared of what? Scared Mr. Halvorson would get mad, Marcus said. Scared I'd get in trouble. Scared no one would believe me. His voice broke. And I was right, he said. No one did believe me. Not for a long time. Pritchard paused. She hadn't expected that answer. No further questions, she said quietly. Marcus was excused. He walked back to his seat, his foster mother's arm around his shoulders. Coyle watched him go. She knew his testimony had been powerful. But she also knew it wasn't enough on its own. The defense would argue he was coached. That he was exaggerating. That his memory was unreliable. She needed to corroborate his account. And she had one more witness who could do that. The next witness was the foster mother who had cared for the white girl. Her name was Sandra Greer. She had agreed to testify reluctantly. She didn't want to be involved. But Coyle had subpoenaed her. Greer took the stand and was sworn in. Coyle asked her to describe her experience as a foster parent. Greer said she had fostered several children over the years. Most placements went well. Some were challenging. But she always tried to do her best. Coyle asked if she knew Thomas Halvorson. Greer nodded. She had met him at a foster parent training session. They had talked a few times. You seem nice, she said. Committed. Did you know he had fostered a child? Yes, Greer said. A little girl. She stayed with him for about 6 months. Did you ever see the child? Once, Greer said. At a county event for foster families. What was your impression? She seemed happy, Greer said. Healthy. Mr. Halvorson was attentive to her. He made sure she had snacks. He played with her. It seemed like a good placement. Coyle paused. And did you know that Mr. Halvorson later fostered another child? A boy? Greer nodded. I heard about it, she said. Did you ever see that child? No, Greer said. Why not? Greer hesitated. Mr. Halvorson stopped coming to the county events, she said. He kept to himself more. Coyle asked if that seemed unusual. A little, Greer admitted. But people have their reasons. Pritchard's cross-examination was brief. She asked Greer if she had any direct knowledge of how Halvorson treated the boy. No, Greer admitted. So you can't say whether he was abusive or not? No, Greer said. I can't. Pritchard sat down. But the point had been made. Halvorson had treated the white girl differently. And the jury had heard it. Coyle rested her case. The defense began the next day. Pritchard called a series of character witnesses. People who had known Halvorson for years. They described him as responsible. Honest. A man who cared about children. One witness was a pastor who had known Halvorson since childhood. He said Halvorson had a strong moral compass. That he wouldn't hurt anyone. Another witness was a former co-worker. She said Halvorson had always been kind to her. Professional. Reliable. The testimony was effective. It painted Halvorson as a decent person. But Coyle knew it didn't address the evidence. Being a good person in public didn't mean you couldn't be cruel in private. The defense's key witness was a nutritionist, Dr. Ellen Marsh. She testified that children's appetites varied widely, that some children were naturally picky eaters, that growth patterns could be influenced by stress, genetics, and numerous other factors beyond nutrition. Pritchard asked if it was possible for a child to be adequately fed and still not grow. Dr. Marsh said yes, it was possible. She acknowledged that chronic malnutrition could stunt growth. But she argued that the evidence in this case wasn't conclusive. The boy could have had an eating disorder, or a psychological aversion to food, or any number of issues that wouldn't be the foster parent's fault. Coyle's cross-examination was sharp. She asked Dr. Marsh if she had reviewed the boy's complete medical history. Dr. Marsh admitted she had only been provided with select records. So you don't know that the boy was growing normally before he was placed with Mr. Halvorson? I wasn't aware of that, Dr. Marsh said. And you don't know that his growth resumed after he was removed from Mr. Halvorson's home? Dr. Marsh hesitated. I wasn't told that either, she said. So your opinion is based on incomplete information? Dr. Marsh looked uncomfortable. I gave my opinion based on what I was asked to review, she said. Coyle pressed. If you had known those facts, that the boy was growing normally before the placement and resumed growing after removal, would that change your opinion? Dr. Marsh paused. Might, she admitted. Coyle let that sit. No further questions. The defense's final witness was Halvorsen himself. Pritchard had debated whether to put him on the stand. It was always a risk. But Halvorsen insisted. He wanted to tell his side. He took the stand with confidence. He looked directly at the jury as he was sworn in. Pritchard walked him through his background, his work history, his decision to become a foster parent. He spoke about wanting to give back, about believing every child deserved a chance. She asked him about Marcus. Halvorsen's tone shifted, becoming more serious. Marcus was a challenging child, he said. He came to me with a lot of trauma, a lot of behavioral issues. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I was committed to helping him. Pritchard asked him to describe his approach. I believe in structure, Halvorsen said. In rules. In consequences. Children need boundaries. Especially children who have experienced chaos. Did you ever withhold food from Marcus? No, Halvorsen said firmly. I provided meals 3 times a day. If Marcus chose not to eat, that was his choice. But the food was there. Did you ever punish him by denying him meals? Never, Halvorsen said. If he missed a meal, it was because he didn't follow the schedule. That's not punishment. That's teaching responsibility. Pritchard asked about the growth records. Halvorsen shook his head. I didn't realize his growth had slowed, he said. If I had known, I would have taken him to a specialist. But he seemed fine to me. Small, yes, but fine. Why do you think his growth slowed? Pritchard asked. Halvorsen shrugged. I don't know, he said. Maybe genetics. Maybe stress. Maybe something from before he came to me. But it wasn't because I didn't feed him. Pritchard asked about the comparison to the girl he had fostered previously. Halvorsen's expression didn't change. Every child is different, he said. The girl was easygoing. She didn't require as much discipline. Marcus needed firmer boundaries. That's all. So you're saying you treated them differently because of their behavior, not because of their race? Correct, Halvorsen said. Race had nothing to do with it. Coyle stood for cross-examination. She approached slowly, holding a folder. Mr. Halvorsen, she said, you testified that you provided meals 3 times a day. Is that correct? Yes, Halvorsen said. And if Marcus missed a meal, it was because he didn't follow the rules? Correct. What rules? Halvorsen listed them. Wake up on time. Be at the table when called. Complete chores before meals. And if he broke one of those rules, he didn't eat? He missed that particular meal, Halvorsen said. But there was always another meal coming. Coyle paused. She opened the folder and pulled out a school attendance record. Mr. Halvorsen, I'm showing you Marcus's school attendance records. Can you see the dates he was marked tardy? Halvorsen glanced at the paper. Yes, there are 43 tardies over 4 years. Does that sound right? I don't know the exact number, Halvorsen said. But Marcus had trouble getting up in the morning. And when he was late, did he miss breakfast? Sometimes, Halvorsen admitted. So on at least 43 occasions, Marcus went to school without eating breakfast at your house? Halvorsen shifted in his seat. If he was late, yes. But the school served breakfast. How do you know he ate it? Coyle asked. Halvorsen hesitated. I assumed he did. But you don't know for sure? No, Halvorsen admitted. Coyle moved to another topic. She asked Halvorsen about the lunches he packed. He said he packed a sandwich and sometimes a piece of fruit. Did you ever pack snacks? No, Halvorsen said. Why not? Because I didn't think he needed them, Halvorsen said. The school nurse noted that Marcus frequently came to her office asking for crackers. Were you aware of that? No, Halvorsen said. If he was hungry, why didn't he tell you? Halvorsen shrugged. I don't know, he said. Maybe he wasn't really hungry. Maybe he just wanted attention. Coyle stared at him. You think a child repeatedly asking the school nurse for food was just seeking attention? Halvorsen didn't answer. Coyle pressed. Or is it possible, Mr. Halvorsen, that Marcus was genuinely hungry because you weren't feeding him enough? I fed him adequately, Halvorsen said, his voice rising slightly. Then why did he stop growing? Coyle asked. I don't know, Halvorsen said. That's not my fault. Coyle pulled out another document. Marcus's medical records from before he was placed with you. She handed them to Halvorsen. Can you see his height measurements from age 4 to age 6? Halvorsen looked at the paper. Yes. He grew 4 inches in those 2 years, correct? Halvorsen nodded. Yes. That's normal growth for a child that age, isn't it? I suppose, Halvorsen said. Now look at his height measurements from age 6 to age 10. The years he lived with you. Halvorsen looked. He grew 2 inches, Coyle said. In 4 years. Half the rate he was growing before he came to you. Can you explain that? Halvorsen's jaw tightened. I can't, he said. Could it be because he wasn't getting enough to eat? No, Halvorsen said. How do you know? Because I know what I provided, Halvorsen said. But you don't know what his body needed, do you? Coyle asked. Halvorsen didn't answer. Coyle shifted again. She asked Halvorsen about Marcus's behavior. You described him as challenging. Can you give me an example? He didn't follow directions, Halvorsen said. He was slow to obey. He asked for things constantly. What kind of things? Snacks, Halvorsen said. Seconds at dinner. Treats. And you said no? Most of the time, yes, Halvorsen said. Because I didn't want him to develop bad habits. Bad habits like asking for food when he's hungry? Coyle asked. Pritchard stood. Objection, she said. Argumentative. Sustained, the judge said. Coyle nodded and moved on. Mr. Halvorsen, you said Marcus came to you with trauma. Is that correct? Yes, Halvorsen said. And you knew that traumatized children need stability and care? Yes. And yet you implemented rules that resulted in him frequently missing meals? They were reasonable rules, Halvorsen said. Reasonable for who? Coyle asked. For any child, Halvorsen said. But Marcus isn't any child, Coyle said. He was a traumatized 6-year-old who had been removed from his mother, who had been through multiple placements, who needed someone to take care of him. I did take care of him, Halvorsen said. By watching him starve? Coyle's voice was sharp now. I didn't. Halvorsen started. By watching his growth stop? By doing nothing while his body deteriorated? Objection, Pritchard said, standing. The prosecutor is badgering the witness. Sustained, the judge said. Miss Coyle, move on. Coyle took a breath. She asked one last question. Mr. Halvorsen, if you could go back, would you do anything differently? Halvorsen looked at her. No, he said. I did what I thought was right. Coyle nodded slowly. No further questions. Closing arguments began the next day. Pritchard went first. She reminded the jury that the burden of proof was on the prosecution, that they had to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. She argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that poor growth didn't automatically mean abuse, that Marcus's statements were unreliable, that he was a traumatized child who might be confused or influenced. She pointed to Halvorsen's character witnesses, to the fact that he had never been in trouble before, to his years of service as a foster parent. This is a man who tried to help, she said, who opened his home to a child in need, and now he's being punished for it. That's not justice. She sat down. Coyle stood. She didn't need notes. She had been preparing this closing for weeks. She walked to the center of the courtroom and looked at the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, this case is about a simple question. What happened to Marcus Brooks during the 4 years he lived with the defendant? She pointed to the chart that had been displayed throughout the trial. The answer is in the numbers. A child who was growing normally stopped growing. A child who should have gained height and weight stayed small. A child who should have thrived simply survived. She paused. The defense wants you to believe this is a mystery, that there could be dozens of explanations. But the evidence points to one. Marcus was not fed adequately. He was not cared for. He was subjected to a system of rules designed to punish him for being a child, for being hungry, for needing more than the defendant was willing to give. She walked along the jury box. You heard Marcus testify. He told you what it was like. The fear, the hunger, the silence. And you heard the defendant. He doesn't deny the rules. He doesn't deny that Marcus missed meals. He just claims it was discipline. But discipline doesn't leave a child stunted. Discipline doesn't stop a body from growing. That's not discipline. That's abuse. Coyle returned to the center of the room. The defense has asked you to ignore the evidence, to focus on character witnesses who never saw what happened behind closed doors, to trust the defendant's version of events even though it contradicts every medical record, every school report, every observation from people who saw Marcus during those years. She shook her head. Don't ignore the evidence. Look at it. Really look at it. And ask yourself, what happened to this child? The answer is clear. She looked at each juror in turn. The defendant is guilty, and Marcus deserves justice. She sat down. The courtroom was silent. The judge gave the jury their instructions. He explained the charges. Felony child neglect. Aggravated abuse of a dependent. Hate-based motive enhancement. He defined each term carefully. Explained what the prosecution had to prove. What standard of evidence applied. The jury listened, some taking notes, others simply watching the judge with serious expressions. He reminded them that their decision had to be unanimous, that they should deliberate carefully, that they should consider only the evidence presented in court. Then he dismissed them. They filed out of the courtroom through a side door into the deliberation room. The deliberation room was small and windowless. A long table sat in the center, surrounded by 12 chairs. There was a whiteboard on one wall, markers sitting in the tray beneath it. A stack of legal pads and pens sat on the table. The jury settled into their seats. For a moment, no one spoke. Then one of the jurors, a man in his 50s who had been a foreman before, cleared his throat. "I guess we should start by electing a foreperson," he said. The others nodded. After a brief discussion, they elected a woman named Carol Hendricks. She was in her early 60s, a retired teacher, calm and organized. She accepted the role with a nod. "All right," she said. "Let's go through this carefully." They began with the first charge: felony child neglect. Carol wrote it on the whiteboard. Underneath, she listed the elements the prosecution had to prove: that the defendant had a duty to care for the child, that he failed to provide adequate care, that this failure resulted in harm or substantial risk of harm. Everyone agreed the first element was met. Halvorsen was the foster parent. He had a clear duty to care for Marcus. The second element was where the discussion began. Did he fail to provide adequate care? One juror, a younger man named Steve, spoke up. "The kid testified he was hungry all the time," Steve said. "He missed meals. The school nurse noticed he was thin. That sounds like inadequate care to me." Another juror, an older woman named Diane, shook her head. "But we only have the kid's word for it," she said. "Kids exaggerate." And Halvorsen said he provided meals. Maybe the kid just didn't eat them. Another juror, a middle-aged man named Robert, interjected. "But what about the growth records?" he asked. "The doctor said the kid's growth stopped. That doesn't happen unless something is wrong." Diane frowned. "The defense expert said there could be other reasons," she pointed out. "Stress, genetics. We can't just assume it was because of food." Carol listened to the back and forth, then spoke. "Let's look at all the evidence together," she said. "Not just one piece." She began listing items on the whiteboard. Medical records showing stunted growth. School nurse notes documenting thinness and requests for food. The forensic interview where Marcus described missing meals. The pediatrician's testimony about normal growth before the placement. The expert testimony that malnutrition was the most likely cause. When she finished, she turned back to the jury. Does this evidence, taken together, show that the defendant failed to provide adequate care? The discussion continued for over an hour. Some jurors were convinced immediately. Others had doubts. Steve argued that the pattern was too clear to ignore. A kid grows normally, gets placed in a foster home, stops growing, gets removed, starts growing again. That's not a coincidence, he said. Diane remained skeptical. But there's no proof Halvorsen deliberately withheld food, she said. Maybe he just didn't realize the kid needed more. That's not the same as neglect. Robert disagreed. If you're a foster parent and your kid is hungry all the time, you should notice, he said. The school nurse noticed. The teacher noticed. He was the one person who should have noticed and he didn't. Or he did and didn't care. Either way, that's neglect. Carol asked for a show of hands. Who thinks the prosecution proved felony child neglect? 9 hands went up. 3 remained down. They weren't ready to vote yet. They moved on to discuss the second charge. Aggravated abuse of a dependent. This charge required proof that the defendant's actions created a substantial risk of serious harm. Steve argued this was clearly met. The kid's growth stopped, he said. His body was literally shutting down. If that's not substantial risk of serious harm, what is? Diane again expressed doubt. But the kid wasn't hospitalized, she said. He didn't collapse. He's alive and seems okay now. Was there really serious harm? Another juror, a woman named Patricia, spoke up for the first time. Just because he survived doesn't mean there wasn't harm, she said. The doctor testified that stunted growth can have long-term effects. Physical and psychological. That's serious harm. Robert nodded. And think about the fear that kid described, he added. Going to bed hungry night after night. Being too scared to ask for food. That's psychological harm right there. Carol made more notes on the whiteboard. She asked if anyone wanted to discuss the hate-based motive enhancement. The room went quiet. This was the most controversial charge. It required proof that Halvorsen's actions were motivated, at least in part, by racial bias. Steve spoke first. Look at how he treated the white girl versus the black boy, he said. The girl got snacks at events. He was attentive to her. But with Marcus he was harsh. Strict to the point of cruelty. That's not a coincidence. Diane shook her head firmly. That's speculation, she said. Maybe he learned from his first placement that he needed to be stricter. Maybe the girl was just easier. We can't assume it's about race without proof. Another juror, a man named James, raised his hand. What about what Marcus said? He asked. That Halvorsen told him he had to work harder than other kids. That people wouldn't give him chances. That sounds like he was treating Marcus differently because he's black. Diane wasn't convinced. Or he was trying to prepare him for reality, she said. That's not necessarily racist. Patricia spoke again. But the prosecution showed that he treated two kids completely differently, she said. The only obvious difference between them was race. What else explains it? The discussion grew heated. Some jurors felt the evidence was strong enough. Others felt it was too circumstantial. Carol let them talk, taking notes, trying to identify points of agreement. After 2 hours they took a break. The bailiff brought them water and sandwiches. They ate in near silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they reconvened, Carol suggested they focus first on the charges they could agree on. Let's start with felony child neglect, she said. Can we all agree that the evidence shows the defendant failed to provide adequate care? She went around the table asking each juror. 9 said yes immediately. 2 said probably. 1 Diane said she wasn't sure. Carol asked Diane what her concern was. I just keep thinking about the defense expert, Diane said. She said there could be other explanations for the slow growth. How do we know it was neglect and not something else? Robert leaned forward. Because the kid told us, he said. He said he was hungry. He said he missed meals. He said he was scared to ask for food. That's not a medical mystery. That's neglect. Diane looked down at her hands. I guess, she said quietly. I just hate the idea of convicting someone when there's any doubt. Carol nodded. I understand, she said. But the judge said beyond a reasonable doubt, not beyond all doubt. Is there a reasonable explanation other than neglect? Diane thought for a long moment. Then she shook her head. No, she admitted. I don't think there is. They took another vote. This time all 12 hands went up. They had unanimous agreement on felony child neglect. Carol marked it on the whiteboard. They moved to aggravated abuse. This vote came more quickly. The evidence of harm was clear. The growth records. The psychological impact. The substantial risk to Marcus's health. 11 jurors voted yes. 1 juror, James, hesitated. I agree there was harm, he said. I just don't know if it rises to the level of aggravated abuse. Carol asked him to explain. Aggravated means severe, right? James said. And yes, this was bad. But I keep thinking of cases where kids are beaten or burned. Is this really on that level? Steve responded immediately. It doesn't have to be physical violence to be aggravated abuse, he said. Starving a kid is severe. Making a kid's body shut down is severe. Just because there are no bruises doesn't make it less serious. Patricia agreed. And think about how long it went on, she said. 4 years. That's not a one-time mistake. That's sustained, deliberate harm. James considered this. Okay, he said. I can see that. They voted again. Unanimous. Aggravated abuse of a dependent. That left the hate-based enhancement. Carol wrote it on the board and underlined it. This is going to be the hard one, she said. Let's talk through it carefully. They reviewed the evidence. The comparison between how Halvorsen treated the white girl and how he treated Marcus. The statements Marcus recalled about working harder than other kids. The lack of any other clear explanation for the different treatment. Steve made the case for the enhancement. He laid out the timeline. Showed how Halvorsen had been patient with the girl but harsh with Marcus from the start. Argued that the racial difference was the only factor that explained the disparity. Diane pushed back. Maybe he was just frustrated, she said. Maybe fostering the boy was harder than he expected. That doesn't make him racist. Robert shook his head. But he didn't give Marcus a chance, he said. The caseworker reports from the beginning show he was strict right away. Before Marcus had even done anything. Why would he be so much stricter with Marcus than with the girl unless race was a factor? Diane didn't have an answer. Patricia spoke up. I think we need to be honest about what we're seeing, she said. A white man takes in a black child and immediately implements harsh rules. He withholds food as punishment. He tells the child he has to work harder than others. He watches the child's health deteriorate and does nothing. Meanwhile, when he had a white child, he was attentive and caring. If that's not racial bias, what is it? James agreed. I didn't want to see it that way at first, he said. But the more I think about it, the more it makes sense. Halvorsen may not have thought of himself as racist. but his actions show a different standard for a black child. Diane was quiet for a long time. Finally she spoke. "I hate that this is true," she said. "But I think you're right." Carol looked around the table. "Does anyone disagree?" No one spoke. She asked for a vote. All 12 hands went up. They had reached a verdict on all charges. Unanimous on each one. Carol filled out the verdict form, her handwriting careful and precise. She signed it and passed it to the others to review. They each read it and nodded. Then she knocked on the door to signal the bailiff. The courtroom was packed when the jury returned. Word had spread that a verdict had been reached. Spectators filled the gallery. Reporters sat with notebooks ready. Marcus was not present. Coyle had decided it was better for him to stay away, to not have to see Halvorson's reaction. Halvorson sat at the defense table, his expression unreadable. Pritchard sat beside him, her jaw tight. The judge entered and everyone stood. He took his seat and called the court to order. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked. Carol stood. "We have, Your Honor." The bailiff retrieved the verdict form and handed it to the judge. He read it silently, his face giving nothing away. Then he handed it back to the bailiff, who returned it to Carol. "The defendant will rise," the judge said. Halvorson stood, Pritchard beside him. "The foreperson will read the verdict," the judge said. Carol cleared her throat. "In the matter of the state versus Thomas Richard Halvorson," she read, "on the charge of felony child neglect, we the jury find the defendant guilty." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Halvorson's expression didn't change. "On the charge of aggravated abuse of a dependent, we the jury find the defendant guilty." Pritchard closed her eyes briefly. "And on the hate-based motive enhancement, we the jury find the defendant guilty." The murmur grew louder. The judge banged his gavel. "Order," he said. He thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them. Then he turned to Halvorson. "Mr. Halvorson, you have been found guilty on all charges. Sentencing will be scheduled within 30 days. Until then you will be remanded to custody." Pritchard stood immediately. "Your Honor, we request bail pending sentencing." The judge shook his head. "Given the nature of the charges and the jury's findings, bail is denied." 2 deputies approached Halvorson. He extended his hands for the cuffs, still silent. As they led him away, he glanced once at the gallery. His face showed confusion, disbelief. He had truly thought he would be acquitted, that the jury would see things his way, that his version of discipline would be vindicated. He had been wrong. Coyle stood outside the courtroom afterward, speaking to reporters. She kept her comments brief. "This verdict is about accountability," she said. "Thomas Halvorson was entrusted with a child's safety, and he failed that child. The jury saw the evidence and made their decision. We're grateful for their service." A reporter asked about the hate-based enhancement. Coyle nodded. "The evidence showed that Mr. Halvorson treated Marcus differently than he treated other children in his care," she said. "The jury determined that race was a factor in that treatment." Another reporter asked about Marcus. "How is he doing now?" Coyle smiled slightly. "He's doing better," she said. "He's in a safe placement. He's growing. He's healing. That's what matters." She declined further questions and left. The sentencing hearing was held 4 weeks later. The courtroom was less crowded this time. The verdict had been delivered. The drama for most observers was over. But for Marcus, for Coyle, and for Halvorson, this was the final chapter. Halvorson was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit. He had lost weight during his time in jail. His face was drawn. He sat at the defense table and stared straight ahead. The judge reviewed the pre-sentence investigation report. It detailed Halvorson's background, his lack of prior criminal history, and the severity of his crimes. Then the judge invited victim impact statements. Marcus had written a letter. He was not present, but Coyle read his words aloud. The letter was simple, brief, but powerful. "I was scared all the time," Marcus had written. "I didn't know why Mr. Halvorson was so mean to me. I thought it was my fault. I thought I was bad. Now I know I wasn't bad. I was just hungry. I'm not scared anymore. But I still remember what it felt like. I don't want any other kid to feel that way." Coyle folded the letter and sat down. The courtroom was silent. Pritchard stood to make a statement on Halvorson's behalf. She argued for leniency, pointed to his lack of prior record, his years of service as a foster parent before this placement, his age and health. She asked the judge to consider probation or a minimal sentence. "Mr. Halvorson made mistakes," she said. "But he's not a monster. He's a man who tried to help and failed. Punishing him harshly won't undo the harm. It will only destroy another life." The judge listened without expression. Then he asked if Halvorsen wished to speak. Halvorsen stood slowly. He looked at the judge, then at the gallery. "I want to say that I never intended to hurt that boy," he said. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought structure and discipline were what he needed." He paused. "I see now that I was wrong. That I should have done things differently. I'm sorry." The apology felt hollow, scripted, as if he still didn't fully understand what he had done. The judge's expression remained neutral. When Halvorsen sat down, the judge spoke. "Mr. Halvorsen," he began, "you were entrusted with one of the most important responsibilities in our society, the care of a vulnerable child. You failed that responsibility in every way. You subjected Marcus Brooks to years of deprivation and psychological harm. You watched his body deteriorate and did nothing. And the jury found that your actions were motivated, at least in part, by racial bias." The judge paused. "I have reviewed the evidence. I have read the victim impact statement. I have considered your lack of prior record and your age. But I have also considered the severity of your crimes, the sustained nature of the abuse, the profound impact on the victim." He looked directly at Halvorsen. "You claim you were providing discipline. But discipline is meant to teach, not to harm. What you did was not discipline. It was cruelty disguised as structure. And you did it to a child who had already suffered more than any child should." The judge announced the sentence. On the charge of felony child neglect, he said, "I sentence you to 5 years in state prison. On the charge of aggravated abuse of a dependent, I sentence you to 10 years in state prison to run consecutively. And due to the hate-based motive enhancement, I am adding an additional 3 years. Your total sentence is 18 years. A gasp ran through the courtroom. Halvorsen's face went pale. "You will be eligible for parole after serving 12 years, the judge continued. "But let me be clear. You will not be released unless and until the parole board is convinced that you understand the gravity of your actions, that you have taken full responsibility, and that you pose no risk to vulnerable individuals in the future." He banged his gavel. "This court is adjourned." Halvorsen was led out of the courtroom. He walked stiffly as if in shock. 18 years. He would be in his 70s when he was eligible for parole. His life as he had known it was over. Pritchard gathered her files, her face tight. She had done her best. But the evidence had been overwhelming, and the jury had seen through her client's justifications. In the gallery, a few people who had supported Halvorsen sat in stunned silence. They had believed him, had thought he was being unfairly targeted. But the sentence made it real, made it impossible to deny. Outside the courthouse, Coyle spoke briefly to the press again. "Justice was served today," she said. "Thomas Halvorsen will be held accountable for the harm he caused. But our work isn't done. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again. That foster children are monitored more closely. That warning signs are not ignored. That every child is valued and protected regardless of their race." She paused. "Marcus deserves to grow up safe, to thrive, to have the childhood that was stolen from him. This verdict is a step toward that. But it's only a step." She walked away without taking further questions. Marcus was told about the verdict by his current foster mother. She sat him down and explained it gently. "Mr. Halvorsen was found guilty," she said. "He's going to prison for a long time." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Does that mean I don't have to see him again?" "No," she said. "You never have to see him again." Marcus nodded slowly. "Good," he said quietly. His foster mother asked how he felt. Marcus shrugged. "I don't know," he said. "It doesn't make what happened go away." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't. But it means people believe you. It means what he did was wrong. And it means you're safe now." Marcus looked up at her. "Am I really safe?" "Yes," she said firmly. "You really are." The case made national news. Headlines focused on the height records, on the comparison between the two foster children, on the racial element. Op-eds were written about systemic failures in foster care, about how easily children slip through the cracks, about the need for better training, better oversight, better accountability. Some people defended Halvorsen, argued that the sentence was too harsh, that he was a scapegoat for a broken system. But most people saw the case for what it was. A man who had abused his power, who had harmed a child under the guise of discipline, who had been caught only because someone finally looked at the numbers. In prison, Halvorsen struggled to adjust. He kept to himself, avoided other inmates. He attended mandatory counseling sessions but said little. The counselor noted that he remained defensive, that he still saw himself as a victim of misunderstanding. It would take years before he began to confront what he had really done, before he stopped blaming Marcus, stopped blaming the system, and started to see his own role in the harm. That reckoning, if it came at all, would be slow and painful. Marcus, meanwhile, began to heal. It wasn't immediate. Healing never is. He continued therapy. Worked through the fear and anger and confusion. Learned to trust again slowly. His body recovered more quickly than his mind. Within a year, he had gained several inches. His weight increased to a healthy level. The pediatrician who examined him was amazed. It's like his body was waiting, she said. Waiting for the chance to grow. Marcus returned to school and made friends. He joined the soccer team. He discovered he liked art. He started to smile more. To laugh. His foster parents applied to adopt him. The process took time, but eventually it was approved. On the day the adoption was finalized, Marcus stood in front of a judge. A different judge in a different courtroom. This judge smiled at him. "Welcome to your forever family," she said. Marcus smiled back. For the first time in years, forever didn't sound scary. It sounded safe. Years later, when Marcus was in high school, he wrote an essay for a college application. The prompt asked him to describe a challenge he had overcome. He wrote about his time in foster care. About the hunger. About the fear. But mostly he wrote about what came after. About learning to trust. About finding a family. About discovering that he was worth caring for. He wrote, "I spent years being told I wasn't good enough. That I needed to earn basic things like food and safety. It took me a long time to understand that was a lie. Everyone deserves to be cared for. Everyone deserves to grow. I almost didn't get that chance. But I did. And now I want to make sure other kids get that chance too." He submitted the essay and was accepted to college. He planned to study social work. To work with foster children. To be the person who noticed when something was wrong. The person who looked at the numbers. The person who believed. The case of State versus Halvorsen became a landmark in Iowa. It changed how foster placements were monitored. Medical records were reviewed more thoroughly. Growth charts were flagged if development slowed. Caseworkers received additional training on recognizing subtle signs of neglect. And foster parents were reminded, explicitly and repeatedly, that discipline could never justify deprivation. The changes came too late for Marcus. But they would help others. That was something. Halvorsen remained in prison. His first parole hearing was denied. The board found he had not demonstrated sufficient remorse or understanding of his crimes. He was told to continue counseling. To take responsibility. To show through his actions that he had changed. Whether he would ever be released was uncertain. But even if he served his full sentence, even if he walked free someday, the verdict would stand. The record would remain. He had been found guilty. Not just of neglect. But of abuse. And of allowing racial bias to shape how he treated a child entrusted to his care. That truth could not be erased. Could not be explained away. It would follow him for the rest of his life. Janet Coyle continued prosecuting cases. But the Halvorsen case stayed with her. She kept a copy of Marcus's victim impact statement in her office. A reminder of why the work mattered. She thought about him often. Wondered how he was doing. Hoped he was thriving. A few years after the trial, she received a letter. It was from Marcus. He thanked her for believing him. For fighting for him. He told her he was doing well. That he had a family now. That he was going to college. He ended the letter with a simple sentence. "You helped me grow." Coyle read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it with the victim impact statement. She would keep both. Forever. The story of Marcus Brooks is not unique. Across the country, children enter foster care every day. Some are placed in loving homes. Others are not. Some thrive. Others suffer in silence. The system is supposed to protect them. But the system is made of people. And people fail. They miss signs. They accept explanations. They move on to the next crisis without looking back. Marcus's case was different only because someone finally noticed. Because a caseworker requested records. Because an expert looked at numbers and saw a story. Because a prosecutor refused to let the abuse be dismissed as discipline. And because a jury believed a child. But Marcus's story is also a reminder. That abuse doesn't always look the way we expect. That harm can be quiet. Incremental. Hidden in routines and rules and explanations that sound reasonable. Until someone looks closely. Until someone asks why. Until someone refuses to accept the easy answer. Thomas Halvorsen believed he was justified. He believed he was teaching a child responsibility. He believed his strictness was necessary. He believed perhaps that he was doing Marcus a favor. But belief doesn't change reality. And reality in this case was measured in inches. In pounds. In a body that stopped growing because it wasn't being fed. In a child who learned to be silent because asking for help made things worse. That was the truth the jury saw. That was the truth the judge recognized. And that was the truth that sent Halvorsen to prison. The height records were simple documents, just measurements taken over time. But they told a story that words couldn't fully capture. They showed, with stark clarity, what happened to Marcus during those 4 years. They showed the cost of neglect, the toll of cruelty, the impact of treating a child as something to be controlled rather than cared for. And they showed that some truths can't be hidden. Not forever. Not when someone is willing to look. In the end, this case was about more than Marcus. It was about every child who has been harmed in silence. Every child whose suffering went unnoticed. Every child who learned not to ask for help because asking only made things worse. It was about the children the system failed. And the children it might still fail. But it was also about hope. About the possibility of justice. About the power of evidence, even when that evidence is quiet and numerical and easy to overlook. About the importance of believing children. Of listening. Of looking closely enough to see what's really happening. Marcus Brooks was one child. One case. One set of height records that finally revealed the truth. But his story echoes beyond the courtroom. It asks us to pay attention. To question explanations that sound reasonable but don't match the evidence. To recognize that abuse takes many forms. And to never, ever dismiss a child's suffering as discipline. Because discipline teaches. Abuse destroys. And the difference between them is not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of fact. A fact that can be measured, documented, proven. If only someone is willing to look. The trial is over. The verdict is in. Halvorsen will spend years in prison, confronting the truth of what he did. Or perhaps never confronting it fully. That part is uncertain. What is certain is this. Marcus Brooks survived. He grew. He healed. He found safety. And his story, painful as it is, serves as a reminder that children deserve care. That foster parents hold a sacred trust. That the system must do better. And that sometimes, justice comes not from dramatic revelations or shocking confessions, but from something as simple as a doctor's chart. A measurement. A number. A truth that could not be denied. In a small courtroom in Iowa in the year 2006, that truth was finally heard. And a child who had been silenced for so long was finally believed. That, in the end, is what mattered most. The Halvorsen case didn't end when the gavel fell. For those who worked in Iowa's child welfare system, it became a turning point. A reckoning with failures that had been building for years. The state's Department of Human Services launched an internal review within days of the verdict. They wanted to understand how Marcus had remained in that placement for 4 years without anyone intervening. What they found was troubling but not surprising. The system had been stretched thin for decades. Caseworkers carried impossibly heavy loads. 30, 40, sometimes 50 cases at a time. They were required to visit each child monthly, but in reality visits were often delayed, skipped, rescheduled indefinitely. When visits did happen, they were brief, surface level. A caseworker would arrive, speak to the foster parent, check that the house was clean, ask the child if everything was okay. If the child said yes, the visit was over. There was no time for deeper investigation. No bandwidth to notice subtle signs. The caseworkers weren't failing because they didn't care. They were failing because they were drowning. The review committee interviewed the caseworkers who had been assigned to Marcus's case over the years. Each one expressed regret, guilt. They remembered him, though they hadn't thought about him much at the time. He was quiet, they said. Compliant. Never caused problems. In a system overwhelmed by crisis, that made him easy to overlook. One caseworker, the woman who had finally noticed the growth records, testified before the committee. She explained how she had stumbled onto the pattern almost by accident. She had been new to the role. Still following procedures carefully. Still checking every box. The longer-tenured caseworkers, stretched thin by years of overwork, had stopped requesting complete medical records. They asked for the most recent checkup and called it done. It was faster. Easier. And in most cases it was fine. But in Marcus's case, it meant the pattern went unnoticed. The caseworker's voice shook as she spoke. If I hadn't been new, she said, if I hadn't followed the procedure exactly, he might still be there. The committee members didn't disagree. The internal review led to immediate changes. Caseworker caseloads were reduced, though not as much as advocates wanted. Budget constraints limited what was possible. But the state did implement new protocols. All foster children would have complete medical reviews annually. Not just the most recent visit, but a comparison over time. Growth charts would be flagged if a child's development slowed or stalled. Caseworkers would receive additional training on recognizing subtle forms of abuse, emotional neglect, psychological harm, deprivation that didn't leave visible marks. And there would be more unannounced visits. Not just scheduled check-ins where foster parents could prepare, but surprise inspections where caseworkers could see what daily life really looked like. The changes were a start. But many people in the system knew they weren't enough. Not while caseworkers were still overworked. Not while funding remained inadequate. Not while the demand for foster homes far exceeded the supply. The Halvorsen case also sparked a broader conversation about race in the foster care system. Nationally, Black children were overrepresented in foster care. They were removed from their homes at higher rates than white children. They stayed in care longer. And they experienced more placement disruptions. Advocates had been pointing this out for years. But the Halvorsen case brought it into sharp focus. A white foster parent had treated a Black child with cruelty, had imposed harsh rules and deprivation, and the system had failed to notice for 4 years. Would the same thing have happened if the child had been white? The question haunted everyone involved. No one could say for certain. But the comparison to the girl Halvorsen had fostered previously was damning. She had been white. She had been treated well. The difference was impossible to ignore. Civil rights organizations called for reforms. They demanded better training for foster parents on racial bias. They demanded more diverse caseworkers and oversight. They demanded accountability for foster parents who discriminated. Some of these demands were met. Iowa implemented mandatory cultural competency training for all foster parents. The training covered implicit bias, racial trauma, and the specific needs of children of color. It wasn't perfect. Some foster parents resented being required to attend. They insisted they weren't racist, that they treated all children the same. But the training continued. Because even well-meaning people could harbor biases, could make assumptions, could impose different standards without realizing it. And children like Marcus paid the price for those assumptions. In the months after the trial, journalists investigated similar cases. They found dozens of children who had been placed in homes where they were treated differently than other foster children. Not all the cases involved race. Some involved children with disabilities. Others involved LGBTQ youth. But the pattern was the same. Vulnerable children placed with adults who saw them as problems to be managed rather than children to be nurtured. Adults who imposed harsh rules. Who withheld affection, food, or basic care. Who justified their treatment as necessary discipline. Most of these cases never reached trial. The children aged out of the system. Or were moved to new placements without investigation. Or stayed silent, convinced no one would believe them. Marcus's case was an exception. It made it to court only because a caseworker noticed the numbers. Because an expert could explain what they meant. Because a prosecutor was willing to fight. Most children weren't that lucky. The foster care system, by its nature, operates in the shadows. What happens in foster homes stays in foster homes unless someone reports it. Children are often too young to advocate for themselves. Too scared. Too conditioned to accept whatever treatment they receive. Foster parents hold immense power. They control access to food, comfort, safety. They can grant or withhold privileges at will. And unless someone is watching closely, they can abuse that power with impunity. The system relies on trust. Trust that adults who volunteer to care for vulnerable children will act in those children's best interests. But trust without verification is dangerous. And verification requires resources the system rarely has. After the trial, Marcus's story was used in caseworker training sessions across Iowa. New caseworkers were taught to look for patterns, to trust their instincts, to remember that abuse doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like a quiet child who never complains. A child who follows all the rules because breaking them means going hungry. A child whose body is slowly failing while everyone around them assumes things are fine. The trainers emphasized one key lesson. Documentation matters. Height records mattered. Weight records mattered. School nurse observations mattered. Individually, these pieces of evidence might not seem significant. But together they told a story. And that story saved Marcus's life. Halvorsen's defense attorney, Linda Pritchard, struggled with the case long after it ended. She had done her job. Defended her client vigorously. Challenged the prosecution's evidence. Argued for reasonable doubt. But the verdict haunted her. She replayed the trial in her mind. The growth charts. Marcus's testimony. The comparison to the white girl. She had tried to explain it away. To argue that every case was different. Every child was different. But deep down she knew the truth. Halvorsen had treated Marcus differently because of his race. Maybe not consciously. Maybe not with overt hatred. But the bias was there. In the assumptions he made. In the standards he imposed. In the lack of empathy he showed. Pritchard had defended clients she believed were innocent before. And she had defended clients she knew were guilty but deserved representation. But Halvorsen was different. He had genuinely believed he was right. He had sat across from her, insisting he had done nothing wrong, and he had believed it. That was what disturbed her most. Not that he was cruel, but that he couldn't see his own cruelty. Couldn't recognize the harm he had caused even when confronted with evidence. She wondered if he ever would. In prison, Halvorsen's first months were difficult. He was housed in a medium-security facility about 2 hours from where he had lived. His sister visited once. The conversation was strained. She told him she believed he had meant well. That the sentence was too harsh. But even as she said it, her voice lacked conviction. She had seen the news coverage. Read the articles. Looked at the photos of Marcus from each year of the placement. The progression was undeniable. A healthy child becoming gaunt. Becoming smaller. Becoming invisible. She didn't visit again. Halvorsen didn't blame her. He spent most of his time in his cell. Reading. Thinking. Replaying the trial. He still believed the jury had gotten it wrong. That they had been swayed by emotion rather than evidence. That he had been a scapegoat for a system that wanted someone to blame. But sometimes late at night, doubts crept in. He remembered Marcus. The boy's thin frame. His quiet voice. The way he flinched when Halvorsen raised his voice. He remembered feeling frustrated with Marcus. Annoyed that the boy couldn't seem to follow simple rules. Irritated that he was always so needy. So hungry. Halvorsen pushed the memories away. He didn't want to think about them. Didn't want to confront what they might mean. The court-mandated counseling sessions began 6 months into his sentence. The counselor was a middle-aged woman named Dr. Ellen Reyes. She had worked with incarcerated individuals for over a decade. She had seen every kind of denial. Every kind of justification. Halvorsen was no different. In their first session, he insisted he had been wrongly convicted. That he had done his best. That the boy had been difficult. Dr. Reyes listened without judgment. She didn't argue with him. Didn't try to convince him he was wrong. She simply asked questions. Tell me about Marcus, she said. What was he like when he first arrived? Halvorsen described him as small, quiet, withdrawn. And how did you respond to that? Halvorsen said he implemented structure. Rules. Consequences. What? Dr. Reyes asked. Why did you think that was what he needed? Because that's what all kids need, Halvorsen said. Especially kids from troubled backgrounds. Dr. Reyes made a note. Did Marcus tell you what he needed? Halvorsen frowned. Kids don't know what they need, he said. That's why they have adults. But you're an adult who didn't grow up in foster care, Dr. Reyes said. How did you know what Marcus needed? Halvorsen didn't answer. The sessions continued weekly. Slowly, Dr. Reyes began to peel back the layers. She asked about the girl Halvorsen had fostered before Marcus. He described her as easy. Cooperative. Sweet. Why was she easier? Dr. Reyes asked. Halvorsen shrugged. She just was. Different personality. But what made her personality different? Halvorsen struggled to articulate it. She listened, he said finally. She didn't push back. And Marcus pushed back? Sometimes, Halvorsen admitted. Give me an example. Halvorsen thought. He'd ask for food between meals, he said. Even though I told him no. He'd keep asking. And that bothered you? Yes, Halvorsen said. It was disrespectful. Or Dr. Reyes suggested gently, he was hungry. If he was hungry, he should have eaten what I gave him at meals, Halvorsen said. But what if what you gave him wasn't enough? It was enough, Halvorsen insisted. How do you know? Dr. Reyes asked. Halvorsen didn't answer. Months passed. Slowly, reluctantly, Halvorsen began to examine his assumptions. He started to see that he had treated Marcus and the girl differently. That he had been more patient with her. More lenient. More willing to overlook mistakes. He tried to explain it away. Different circumstances, he told Dr. Reyes. Different challenges. But Dr. Reyes pressed. What was different about the circumstances? Halvorsen couldn't articulate it without acknowledging race. And he wasn't ready to do that. Not yet. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to rebuild his life. His adoption by his foster parents was finalized when he was 11. He took their last name. For the first time, he felt like he belonged somewhere. The nightmares continued for a while. Dreams of being hungry. Of being locked in his room. Of Halvorsen's stern face telling him he didn't deserve to eat. But over time the nightmares faded. His therapist helped him process the trauma, helped him understand that what happened wasn't his fault, that he hadn't been a bad kid. He had been a scared kid. And scared kids deserve care, not punishment. In middle school, Marcus joined the debate team. His coach noticed he was articulate, thoughtful. He had strong opinions and wasn't afraid to express them once he felt safe. The coach encouraged him to enter competitions. Marcus was nervous at first. Public speaking terrified him. But he pushed through the fear. And he discovered he was good at it. He won his first competition in 8th grade. His adoptive parents were in the audience. They cheered louder than anyone. Afterward, his adoptive father hugged him. "We're so proud of you," he said. Marcus smiled. It was a real smile. The kind that reached his eyes. High school brought new challenges. Marcus struggled with trust, with letting people in. He had close friends, but he kept parts of himself hidden. He didn't talk about his time in foster care unless someone asked directly. And even then he kept it vague. "It was hard," he'd say, "but I'm okay now." Most people didn't push for details. But his girlfriend, a girl named Jasmine he met junior year, was persistent. She noticed when he flinched if someone raised their voice. Noticed when he hoarded snacks in his locker. Noticed the way he sometimes stared at his plate during lunch as if making sure the food was really there. She asked him about it one day after school. They were sitting in his car, parked outside her house. "You don't have to tell me," she said. "But if you want to, I'm here." Marcus looked out the windshield. He hadn't told anyone the full story in years. But something about Jasmine made him feel safe. So he told her. Not everything, but enough. He told her about being hungry, about the rules, about learning to be quiet. Jasmine listened without interrupting. When he finished, she reached over and took his hand. "I'm sorry that happened to you," she said. "You didn't deserve that." Marcus felt something loosen in his chest. "Thank you," he said quietly. By the time Marcus applied to colleges, he had decided on social work. He wanted to help kids like him. Kids who were stuck in bad placements, who were too scared to speak up, who needed someone to notice. He wrote about this in his application essays. Several schools offered him scholarships. He chose a state university about 2 hours from home, close enough to visit, far enough to feel independent. His adoptive parents helped him move into the dorms. His adoptive mother cried when they said goodbye. "You're going to do amazing things," she said. Marcus hugged her. "I'm going to try," he said. Halvorson's parole hearing came after 12 years. He was in his late 60s by then. Grayer. Thinner. He had spent over a decade in prison, and it showed. Dr. Reyes submitted a report to the parole board. She described Halvorson's progress in counseling. He had, over the years, begun to take some responsibility. He acknowledged that he had been too harsh, that he had made mistakes. But Dr. Reyes noted that he still struggled to fully accept his role. He often framed his actions as misguided rather than harmful, as errors in judgment rather than abuse. The parole board read the report. They also read the victim impact statement from the trial. Marcus's words, written when he was 10 years old. They reviewed the medical records, the growth charts, the school nurse's notes. They considered the nature of the crime, the sustained deprivation over years, the racial bias the jury had found, and they denied parole. The board's statement was brief. Mr. Halvorson has not demonstrated sufficient understanding of the harm he caused. He has not shown genuine remorse. He will be reconsidered for parole in 3 years. Halvorson received the news in his cell. He sat on his bunk, holding the letter, and felt a wave of despair. 3 more years. Minimum. He would be over 70 by the next hearing. He thought about Marcus. Wondered where the boy was now. Whether he was happy. Whether he ever thought about those years. Halvorson wanted to believe Marcus had forgotten, had moved on, was living a normal life unburdened by the past. But part of him knew that wasn't true. Trauma didn't just disappear. It lingered, shaped you, changed you. And Halvorson had been the source of that trauma. For the first time, he let himself fully feel the weight of that. Marcus graduated from college with a degree in social work. He was hired by the same county agency that had once overseen his case. It felt like coming full circle. His first day on the job, he was assigned to shadow an experienced caseworker. They visited 3 homes that day, met with foster parents and children, checked that everything was okay. At the 3rd home, Marcus watched as the caseworker spoke with a young boy. The boy was quiet, withdrawn. He answered questions with one-word responses. The caseworker seemed satisfied. She marked the visit as complete and prepared to leave. But Marcus hesitated. "Can I ask him something?" he said to the caseworker. She shrugged. "Sure." Marcus knelt down to the boy's level. He asked gently, "Do you get enough to eat here?" The boy's eyes widened slightly. He glanced at the foster parents, then nodded. But Marcus saw the hesitation, the fear. He recognized it. He asked another question. "If you're hungry between meals, do you feel like you can ask for food?" The boy hesitated longer this time, then shook his head. Marcus looked up at the caseworker. "We need to investigate this placement," he said quietly. That case became Marcus's first major intervention. He requested medical records, compared growth charts, spoke with the boy's teachers, and he found a pattern. Not identical to his own experience, but similar enough. The foster parents were withholding adequate food, using meals as leverage for obedience. The boy was losing weight. Marcus documented everything and presented it to his supervisor. The boy was removed from the home within a week. The foster parents lost their license, and Marcus felt something he hadn't expected. Relief. He had stopped it, had seen the signs early enough to intervene. The boy was safe now, and Marcus had been the one to notice. Over the next few years, Marcus built a reputation in the department. He was the caseworker who looked closely, who asked the hard questions, who didn't accept easy answers. Some foster parents resented him, complained that he was too intrusive, too suspicious. But Marcus didn't care. He wasn't there to make foster parents comfortable. He was there to protect children. And he knew better than most how easy it was for harm to go unnoticed. Halvorson's second parole hearing came 3 years later. He was 71. Dr. Reyes submitted another report. This one was more favorable. Halvorson had, in recent years, made significant progress. He had stopped deflecting, stopped blaming Marcus. He had begun to acknowledge that his actions were abusive, that his racial bias, whether conscious or not, had shaped how he treated Marcus, that he had caused profound harm. In their final counseling session, he had said something that stuck with Dr. Reyes. "I thought I was teaching him," Halvorson said. "But I was just punishing him for being a child who needed more than I was willing to give. That's what I can't forgive myself for." Dr. Reyes noted this in her report. She recommended parole with conditions, continued counseling, no contact with children, regular check-ins with a parole officer. The parole board reviewed the case again. They read Dr. Reyes's report. They considered Halvorson's age, his health, which was declining, the fact that he posed no significant public safety risk. But they also considered the severity of his crimes, the lasting impact on Marcus, the need to send a message that such abuse would not be tolerated. They debated for hours. Finally, they reached a decision. Parole granted. Halvorson would be released. But the conditions were strict. He was prohibited from any contact with children. He was required to attend weekly counseling sessions. He would be monitored closely. Any violation would send him back to prison immediately. Halvorson was released on a cold morning in March. His sister picked him up from the facility. They drove in silence for a while. Then she asked, "What are you going to do now?" Halvorson stared out the window. "I don't know," he said. "Try to live with what I did, I guess." His sister didn't respond. She drove him to a small apartment she had helped arrange. She stayed long enough to make sure he had what he needed. Then she left. Halvorson sat alone in the apartment. It was quiet, empty. He thought about the years he had lost, the damage he had caused, the life he could have lived if he had made different choices. But mostly he thought about Marcus. He wondered if the boy, now a man, was happy. He hoped so. It was the least he deserved. Marcus heard about Halvorson's release from a victim advocate. She called to inform him as a courtesy, to make sure he felt safe. Marcus was quiet for a moment after hearing the news. Then he said, "It's fine. I'm not afraid of him anymore." The advocate asked if he wanted to pursue a restraining order. Marcus considered it, then shook his head. "No," he said. "He can't hurt me now." And he meant it. Halvorson had no power over him anymore. Marcus had built a life, a career, a family of his own. He had married Jasmine 2 years earlier. He had healed. Not completely. Healing from trauma is never complete. But enough. Enough to know he was safe. Enough to know he was valued. Enough to know that what happened wasn't his fault. Years passed. Halvorson lived quietly. He attended his counseling sessions. He stayed out of trouble. He died at 78 in a nursing home with his sister at his bedside. His obituary was brief. It didn't mention the trial. His sister had made sure of that. But the people who knew him remembered. The case workers, the lawyers, the jurors. They remembered what he had done. And they remembered Marcus. Marcus never attended Halvorson's funeral. He didn't even know about it until weeks after it happened. When someone told him, he felt nothing. No grief. No relief. Just a quiet acknowledgement. That chapter of his life was closed. It had been closed for a long time. Halvorson's death didn't change that. Marcus continued his work in child welfare for decades. He became a supervisor, then a director. He implemented policies that changed how the state monitored foster placements. He trained caseworkers to recognize subtle signs of abuse. He advocated for better funding, more resources, lower caseloads. He wasn't always successful. The system was slow to change, resistant, but he kept fighting, because he knew what it felt like to be overlooked, to be harmed in silence. And he was determined that fewer children would experience what he had. On his 50th birthday, Marcus gave a speech at a state conference on foster care. He spoke about his experience, not in detail, but enough. He told the audience about the years he spent in a home where he was hungry, where he was punished for needing care, where no one noticed until it was almost too late. And then he told them about the caseworker who finally saw the pattern, about the prosecutor who fought for him, about the system that, despite its flaws, eventually protected him. He ended with a challenge. We can do better, he said. We have to do better. Because there are children right now in homes just like the one I was in, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to care, waiting for someone to see the truth hiding in numbers and records and quiet compliance. We have to be those people. The audience applauded. Some were crying. But Marcus didn't stay for the reception afterward. He went home to his family, to his children who would never know the hunger he had known, to his wife who had helped him heal, to the life he had built despite everything. The Halvorson case is still taught in social work programs across the country. Students study the medical records, the timeline, the failures and eventual intervention. They discuss what went wrong, what went right, what could have been done differently. And they learn the most important lesson of all. That abuse often hides in plain sight. That children's bodies tell stories their voices cannot. And that paying attention, really paying attention, can save a life. Marcus's life was saved by someone paying attention. By someone looking at growth charts and asking why. That simple act of noticing changed everything. It brought justice. It brought accountability. And it gave Marcus a chance to become who he was meant to be. Not a victim. Not a statistic. But a survivor who used his pain to protect others. That is his legacy. And it is a legacy that continues to ripple outward, touching lives he will never know about. Children who are safer because of the policies he implemented. Caseworkers who are more vigilant because of the training he designed. Foster parents who think twice before imposing harsh consequences because they know someone is watching. That is the true ending to this story. Not the trial verdict. Not Halvorson's death. But the countless interventions that never made headlines. The children who were protected because someone remembered Marcus's case and looked more closely. That is justice. Not perfect. Not complete. But real. And for Marcus, for the child he once was and the man he became, it is enough.